Roger Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this day 12 of the 2025 federal election. We're covering it all for you, breaking down the big stories and developments with our experts. I'm joined by Sean Spear, co-founder and editor-at-large. Sean, how do we find you at the end of a busy week here at The Hub?
Yeah, doing well, Roger. It's been great to kind of feed off the energy of our audience. We've seen the numbers rise each day, and so I'm having a lot of fun trying to keep on top of what has been a pretty action-packed campaign so far. How about you?
Yeah, well, I was pumped. Our huge live stream this week, 5,000 people joining us for David Frum to break down the tariffs live as they were announced in the Rose Garden. You can catch that video. You were talking to Preston Manning yesterday, a terrific conversation. I also urge people to check out that video on our channel, and just urge you that if you're enjoying these live streams, please subscribe to the channel, share with friends. Let's get this live stream cooking in this election as we approach the halfway mark. Sean, as we do at the top of every show, let's do just a quick review of where the leaders are today. We have Mark Carney making a big announcement in Montreal about the CBC. We'll get into that with our next guest. Pierre Poilievre is in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. He's speaking later this morning. And Jagmeet Singh is in Montreal. He's got a presser this morning, and we'll be following that throughout the day at the Hub. On policy announcements, it was a busy 24 hours, Sean. We had Carney announcing reciprocal tariffs on U.S. autos, 25%. Some details to be worked out, but again, more reporting on that in the Hub also. Pierre Poilievre taking the GST off made in Canada cars to lower the price of cars for Canadians. And this time I got to give some kudos to Jagmeet Singh here. I like this idea. Victory bonds for Canada, Sean. We're going to be issuing bonds that would pay above a GIC, a quarter point above a GIC. But what I really like, Sean, is they would mature tax-free. So if you buy this bond over 10 years and it's got, I don't know, 5% coupon, you walk away with 50% tax-free. People who hold bonds know that bonds are taxed. They're one of the highest taxed kind of investment instruments out there. You pay effectively a 50% tax on your bonds if they're not held in a tax-free account. So I kind of like this idea. It might be expensive, but a safe way to get good returns. I'm not going to say no to that. But Sean, I got to start with you with some new polling out this morning from Nanos, a pollster we like to follow because we think he's got good methodology. He generally looks at people who are going to the polls to vote as opposed to people who are going to be just saying I'm voting. These are likely voters. So look at this, Sean. 50% now, 51% for Mark Carney nationally, up overnight on the Trump tariffs. Pierre Poilievre down 2% to 30. We're seeing, I don't know, Sean, I think we've got to be honest here, continuing momentum on the Liberal poll numbers. I think we've all been, I don't know, just wondering how much further can they push north of what are now kind of stratospheric numbers for the Liberal campaign.
Yeah, Mark Carney's strategy of the anti-campaign campaign seems to be working. As we've talked about at various times over the course of the past 10 days or so, Daryl Burker's insight that for Mark Carney, governing is campaigning, I think has proven right thus far in the campaign. In a way, Roger, not only is he not really campaigning in a conventional sense, he's not even paying that much attention to the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre. You really do get the sense that he's trying to socialize Canadians into the idea that he is indeed the Prime Minister and he ought to remain the Prime Minister after the election campaign. And that strategy, which on the face of it is rather unconventional, seems to be working.
Yeah, I would also just say we are seeing this morning large reciprocal tariffs from China, 34% back on America for its tariffs on Monday. This is causing yet another sell-off in markets this morning, Sean. And I wonder if that does not also help Mark Carney. If Canadians start seeing their investment portfolios taking a dive, it's another kind of another quiver in his arrow in terms of his strength on perceived ability to manage what could be, we don't know, it's only been 48 hours, but what is turning into a market rout and, could be signaling a larger risk of a global recession. What do you think about that, Sean?
Yeah, the this campaign, as we've talked about from the beginning, is about this tension that David Coletto has come to characterize as scarcity versus precarity. If it's fundamentally about scarcity, it advantages the Conservatives. But polling seems to suggest that if people come to think of it through the lens of precarity, it advantages Mark Carney and the Liberals. And so, to the extent to which we continue to see turmoil in the markets, chaos in our global economic system, one can't help but think that it tips the scale from scarcity to precarity, and in turn to the advantage of Mark Carney.
Yeah, well said. Well, let's go to our first guest. Very timely to have him joining us because we want to dig into Mark Carney's announcement on the CBC this morning. It's James Moore, former heritage minister, prominent figure in the Harper government, and now in private practice in Vancouver. So, James, great to have you in the program. And I want to talk about BC too. What's going on out there? What you're hearing on the ground? But let's talk. Let's start with Mark Carney's CBC announcement this morning. Basically, a kind of sounds like from what we're literally listening to the speech live as we came on air, like a status quo, 100 million more if we're accurate in what we heard. Certainly a pullback from the Justin Trudeau government, who had effectively been flashing, James, that their preferred preference would be a significant increase to the CBC's budget.
Yeah, like I think part of the reason why I think he feels that he has to do that is, frankly, the shakiness of his French. The CBC is one thing in English Canada, in Quebec, and to the 2.5 million French-speaking Canadians outside of the province of Quebec, the CBC is something else, which is the physical infrastructure is seen by many as the physical infrastructure necessary for the protection, celebration, and promotion of the French language. So I think that's part of it. And also, I think you notice since pre-writ, when Pierre Poilievre had his speech there in Ottawa, where he tried to sort of pivot towards the Canada First message, that he's dropped being super aggressive and talking about defunding the CBC. Doesn't mean he doesn't still believe it. Doesn't mean he still wouldn't do it. But he's dropped that from sort of one of the main thumping points of his speeches daily throughout the campaign, which he's been doing for over 2 years. There's a reason why, is because he knows that for a lot of Canadians, they don't want to hear that right now. They want to hear about coming together. They want to hear about institutions that have some nostalgia around them, around Canadian culture and the flag and documentaries and children's programming and those types of things. The CBC may not be any of those things, but it symbolically is for some Canadians, and at least the voting universe that the Liberals are pursuing, which is the NDP, Liberal, and even Green switch voters who still have that warm place in their heart for that kind of thing, that they're looking for a prime minister who will kind of gather around and protect all those institutions that for generations have been seen to be and have the reputation of being a nation-building institutions. So I think there's a lot of politics about the CBC, as is always the case. There's never actually sort of really a substantive conversation about what to actually do with the thing. It's just, it either gets sort of overly nostalgized when it's not even what people are talking about, the nostalgia, or they gets punched in the face constantly because it's a good source of revenue generation for fundraising, but nobody actually is clear about how much you're going to defund, not 100%. Like it's one of those aggravating areas of public policy where nobody actually wants to sit down and write down clearly, right, should we have a public broadcaster? How much are we prepared to pay for it? And what should it do? We just kind of sloganeer around it on both sides. And then it's the volleyball of Canadian politics. It just gets pounded across a net back and forth. So.
Well, that's something I wanted to ask you about, James, because as you say, a lot of the CBC debate ultimately revolves around vibes. And one also gets the sense that vibes are at the heart of the Canadian public's growing perception that Mark Carney is best suited to protect Canadian interests vis-a-vis the Trump administration. I was thinking about it recently. If you took quotes from Poilievre and Carney and removed their names or attribution when it comes to Trump, it's not obvious to me that Canadians would be able to distinguish between the two. It's instead rooted in a sense of intuition, that Carney is better on this file than Polyev. Uh, as someone who spent a lot of time in elected politics, what do you do when on the most salient issue your opponent is leading you, not rooted necessarily in substance, but vibes? How do you try to push back against that?
I think you seek out an area of public policy that the other side would never touch, that would have broad appeal with Canadians and voters who might see you as the person who's the most naturally, incredibly positioned to actually implement that. You're right, Mark Carney, like it sort of gets said, he's got a resume, but a resume isn't actually a career or a demonstration of capacity. It's true. However, there's a couple big pieces on that resume, right? Is that governor of the Bank of Canada during the global economic crisis? Well, we might be having one. Governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England during Brexit, and the European mass geopolitical and economic realignment. We might be having one of those, so just kind of, and Pierre Poilievre, he also has a sterling resume. That's one of the things I say about this campaign, is that you're fortunate in the country when you have a choice between two people to be prime minister, when you have two people of enormous substance, real character, real capacity, a real experience. And by the way, they also, both of them, I think at their heart are really thoroughly decent human beings. And by the way, they can do all of this in both English and French for the most part. That resume capacity of both of these gentlemen is actually really impressive. And, I know as a conservative, you're sort of not supposed to say nice things, but it's kind of hard in this campaign not to be comforted by the fact that we actually do have two individuals who are real people of substance and capacity in this time when we need it most. The biggest, I think, Achilles heel for Mark Carney, though, is that even in the best iteration of Mark Carney that might be presented and could be elected as prime minister, is that should he be elected prime minister, he'll be dangling 180 lead anchors around his ankles. And as much as he may think that he can do what he wants, the reality is we still have a parliamentary system, and that's sort of the dislocation of Canadian politics that I often find the most frustrating. We have a parliamentary system, but we have a presidential style political structure around it, and so we just point cameras at the two leaders and we say, "Well, is it Carney or is it Poilievre? Is it Harper? Is it Trudeau?" And of course, majority parliaments, if Pierre were to win, out of 105 senators, there are 12 conservatives left, which is to say there's actually 8 senators left who are sort of aggressively, functionally pursuing their mandates. So like, how does that play into his capacity to do things like defund the CBC or lower taxes and so on? So governing is a complicated thing. And I think Mark Carney, because of his resume and because of those two crises that he was associated with in the past, people say, well, then he's the man for the hour. Yeah, but being prime minister is a lot more complicated than that. He's going to have a crew of people around him from Gregor Robertson in British Columbia to sort of fiscal moderates in central Canada to Stephen Guilbeault. It's like an unmanageable cast of characters in a band, and you're going to try to get them to all sing a same rational song sheet. It's kind of hard to imagine.
Yeah, it's like my grade 8 son. It's musical recitals. One kid with a tuba, one kid with a flute. A lot of cacophony there. James, what thoughts about the campaign as we're approaching the halfway mark here? It's amazing as we just reviewed those Nanos numbers off the top to really see that the Liberal numbers aren't blunted yet. There's still, if you accept these polls, they're still getting an updraft, whether it's from Trump, whether it's now, as you say, a global recession that we're contemplating, and a steep sell-off in global markets. What do you think that the Poilievre campaign should be considering at this point? Is it a moment to take some more risks, to, as you say, put out some policies there that really allow you to pick a fight, maybe punch through the media a bit? I guess my perception is that the Pierre Poilievre campaign is running a very disciplined campaign. They're running a very programmatic campaign, but it seems almost like a campaign that was, planned out 30, 60, 90 days ago, as opposed to a campaign where we're on day 12. And if you believe Nanos' numbers, the Liberals now have a precipitous lead.
However, Abacus has it 42-40 conservatives. Like Innovative Research has it a tie. So I'm seeing different polling numbers and credible firms who are cited by newsrooms from across the country are actually showing pretty significantly different numbers, like anywhere from a 15-point gap. So I don't really know what to believe. But let's stick with the nanos numbers if those are to be believed. If that were to be cemented and be a reality on election night, Pierre Poilievre would have a better showing of any conservative leader since Brian Mulroney in 1988, and not do well. And that would be, it obviously point to the fact that Jagmeet Singh is the worst, most incompetent, real bad, not good NDP leader in my lifetime. And, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard when you have a New Democratic Party that goes from Jack Layton in 100 seats and Jagmeet Singh falling on his face in the first, 13 hours of the campaign, never getting back up. And there's no real competition there. So Mark Carney never actually has to tilt to the left. Maybe today in the CBC is part of that, but that's not within the Liberal NDP broad universe. That's not really tilting left. But he doesn't have to sort of jab step to the left on abortion or guns or any sort of those usual hot topics that liberals use to agitate the base. So if he never actually has to tilt left and value signal in that direction, and he can just sort of absorb that NDP vote because Jagmeet Singh is so awful, then Mark Carney can just stand there and frankly sort of campaign like Stephen Harper, talk about interprovincial trade, be dispassionate, be monotone but serious and stern, and stand in front of the flags and do his thing and be prime minister and campaign. That's an extraordinarily tough challenge for Pierre to try to punch through. I think you're right that if the nanos numbers are to be believed and the abacus ones are not to be believed, and that is the reality of things, then yeah, Pierre might have to start, sending up some flares in the night sky about some really aggressive policies. And I can think of things like whether it's immigration or even more aggressive stuff on taxation. That liberals would not go. Decentralization of authorities on immigration is one, particularly to Quebec, where I can imagine that would have some purchase and it could be an opportunity. But then, on the other hand, Canadians might react to something like that and say, well, I see what you're doing there, and I can see that you're starting to panic. That seems like panic and instability, and everything about the world is unstable and panicking, and a guy with gray hair in a gray suit who's kind of monotone and boring, not sort of putting out outlandish policies. Maybe boring is you're reaffirming my choice that Mark Carney might be the guy. So I don't envy Pierre's position strategically because we've never really seen anything like this before, either the collapse in the NDP or the complication of the Trump factor. We've never seen it.
That's the issue with wedge issues, right, James? They cut both ways. As we wrap up, I just want to look forward. I mentioned earlier your extensive history as an elected official. What are you going to be looking towards in terms of this race moving in one direction or the other? Let me put a specific hypothesis to you. To what extent do you think Easter might be significant in terms of people coalescing around their ultimate voting preference as they gather with their family and talk about what's happened over the course of the campaign? Should we be looking to post-debate Easter weekend as a significant one? And if so, what precisely will you be looking for?
Ian Black's a former cabinet minister, and he's running in my former riding, and he's run for office a lot of times, and he knows what he's looking for. He's finding now, 3.5 weeks out, he says the undecideds are disappearing fast. That they know. I'm articulating something that they probably don't, which is they saw Vladimir Zelensky sitting in that chair. They know they know that the next prime minister is going to be in that same chair a couple, 2, 3, 4 weeks after the campaign. They know who the two options are, and they've eyeballed them, and they have a very clear understanding of who they like and who they don't. And he says the independents are disappearing really quickly. So on election night, I'm looking at, if there is a massive sweep of Atlantic Canada like 2015, then that's probably a wrap. But where obviously it will really matter is I don't think Mississauga, Brampton, Etobicoke, I don't think those seats, it's not going to be a checkerboard. It's not going to be, one here, one there, a little bit of red, a little bit of, no. When Canadians make up their mind, and it's a very sort of mysterious thing about Canadian politics. When Canadians make up their mind and they're clear about what they want, they don't do it subtly. I think it'll be a strong, firm majority mandate for Pierre or for Mark Carney. And I still think the campaign. I don't think it's over, but I think it'll be a clear, strong mandate. We've had two minority parliaments in a row. I think Canadians, like they did after 08 going into 11, I think they really wanted a firm mandate for Stephen Harper, and I think they want to have a prime minister with a firm, clear mandate, and I think they'll vote that way.
Yeah. Last question, James. You're coming to us from British Columbia. We're seeing, much like here in Ontario, a strong lead, at least at this point in the campaign, for the Liberals in the province. Where's that expressing itself? Do you feel that it's got some fundamentals under it? Is it atmospherics? What's your temperature reading on the BC federal scene?
It's a very regional province. Don't mean for it to be a cop out, but like the old, Vancouver Island North, Nanaimo and North, and the Vancouver Island is a two-way NDP Conservative fight, and I think Conservatives are going to pick up and do very well there. The collapse of the NDP vote, those blue collar voters. I was just in Prince George yesterday. People drive an F-150. You're a member of a private sector union. You work with your hands, tools, and machine. You traditionally vote New Democrat because you want a government that's out there for little guy. If you own a French cuff shirt, don't knock on my door. Those voters out there who are everywhere in provincial politics, they're voting Conservative, and they like Pierre Poilievre, and they like what he's saying. So, I think you'll see Ellis Ross up in Skeena be a member of Parliament. I think the North Island, Aaron Gunn, down through Nanaimo. I think all those ridings could very well flip. The working class suburbs of Vancouver, I think, could very well flip. It's the West Van, North Van, Tri-Cities where I live, where the Liberal Conservative two-way fight is animated. That I think it might be more challenging. But again, British Columbians can swing. British Columbians and Quebecers are the two sort of broad cohorts of Canadian voters who make up their minds last, and they do so in a very sort of direct way, one way or the other. And so I think it'll be interesting to watch on election night.
Well, James Moore, former federal cabinet minister, senior advisor at Edelman, thank you so much for coming on the program. Let's get you back on. You'll be our point man in BC to break down this campaign as we head into some consequential days ahead.
And by the way, congratulations on the Hub. Really important institution. I said this to Sean a couple times, at a time where there's this transition from old school mainstream media, newspapers and all that. The hub.ca, from where you began to where you are now, an enormously important organization already in sort of filling the air and filling our phones and brains with good ideas, thoughtful conversation about really complicated topics in a way that isn't being done too often. And I think it's really important. So congrats on the success you've had so far.
Thank you, James. It does not cost $1.3 billion to do this, so you're off the hook.
Yes. But the empire's growing.
Yeah, we're sitting in a $20,000 studio here, producing television we think is probably as good as anything you're going to watch, maybe a little bit better than anything you're going to watch on the CBC. Sean, let's bring on our next guest for the second part of our Election 2025 show for the campaign for this Friday, and that's Joseph Steinberg from the University of Toronto. He's an associate professor in the Department of Economics. We're just going to get him onto the screen momentarily. And as we do that, Sean, what are the types of questions, that are top of mind for you in terms of economics as we begin to think about, the midpoint of this campaign? As you've mentioned to me in the past, the parties, especially the Conservatives, have been out there with some big economic announcements, big tax expenditures. How much room is there left in the remainder of this campaign to actually get into economic fundamentals when these big campaign pledges are already out the door?
Yeah, in a world of a significant federal deficit, already one that's likely to deteriorate over the coming weeks and months, the different parties have made pretty significant commitments when it comes to spending and tax cuts, Roger, that is no doubt going to worsen the deficit. But one of the biggest challenges here, of course, is the degree of economic uncertainty that's hanging over the country. That has fiscal implications. It has implications for household spending, employment, and so on. And so we're so fortunate to have Joseph with us, one of the country's leading scholars on trade policy, who these days I think is feeling pretty frustrated because the Trump administration is acting, in conflict with theory and practice and everything else when it comes to the radical trade policy announcement we saw this week. And so I think being able to have him help us understand the economic effects on the world and of course Canada is a crucial backdrop to this election campaign.
Sure. Let's go to Joseph now. We've got him on the show. Well, Joseph, I want to start with Larry Summers' reaction to yesterday's, Wednesday's trade announcements, reciprocal tariffs from the president. Larry Summers, former senior Obama official, said, quote, "This is to economics what creationism is to biology." Do you agree?
I do agree. It's wild. It's much bigger and much worse than I think pretty much every economist out there who's been analyzing this was expecting. Larry Summers, he's not the only one who has reacted this way.
Sean, jump in.
And yeah, well, just why don't you just elaborate on that point, Joseph? The administration has made the argument that there's something fundamentally unbalanced about the global trading system and America's relationship to countries around the world. I think there was some sympathy for that argument in certain cases, but instead of pursuing, for instance, changes in the relationship with China, it's decided to essentially set out in the name of trade wars with virtually every country in the world. Why don't you just talk a bit about the consequences of such an approach?
Yeah, so there's lots that can be said about the justification, but I think in terms of the consequences, look, I think the easiest way to, foresee what the consequences are going to be is to look at what the reaction of, stock markets has been so far. I mean, we're seeing precipitous declines, unprecedented within the last, decade or so, even more, going all the way back until the Great Recession, all across the U.S. Equities markets. This is to some degree spilling over around the world as well. But the concentration of this reaction, to U.S. equities is telling us that this is really going to drag down the U.S. economy a lot. Wednesday night, I frantically put this scenario into my model. I got some results out of it. Look, it doesn't look good. There's going to be a very pronounced short-run decline in the U.S. economy. There's no way that if these tariffs stay in place, that the U.S. economy won't go into recession shortly. To some degree, that will drag down the rest of the world economy. Canada, of course, we're very exposed to the U.S. economy. There's a good chance that we'll be dragged down with the U.S. to some degree. But I think it is important to emphasize that unlike all of the announcements that we've had so far about tariffs against Canada and Mexico, where the pain was really going to be concentrated here at home in Canada, this latest announcement really does indicate economic harm that is centered around the U.S. economy itself.
Yeah. Joseph, we've seen big sell-offs in oil, which is interesting. So really significant drops in Brent and WTI. And we're also seeing those drops not just, in the short end contracts, but contracts out 8 to 12 or so months. Is that again predicting at least a heightened risk for a global recession? That if commodity prices are now reacting to the fact that these tariffs are eliciting a large-scale counter-response by the world's other economic superpower, China, that we are into something, much bigger than we even thought we were into as of Wednesday night?
I think there's a potential for that, but certainly I think the decline in oil prices is indicative of expectations that the U.S. economy itself is definitely going to go into a pretty big recession this year, and that alone is going to drag down global demand for oil substantially. But as you said, there is a potential for this to spill over around the world. That said, I think it's also indicative to look at the behavior of the U.S. dollar in just the last couple of days. We've seen a substantial weakening of the U.S. dollar since late Wednesday night. And it's, to some people, that has been surprising in that tariffs raise prices. And kind of the standard economic intuition for what should happen is that should cause the U.S. dollar to appreciate. We've seen the opposite. What's that telling us? That's telling us that expectations are that the U.S. economy is going to substantially weaken relative to other economies around the world.
Yeah, bond
and
bond
that
yields have
weakening is going to
declined.
drag down the dollar even further than the tariffs are going to, increase prices.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Sean, over to
Hmm.
you.
Yeah, well, Joseph, you've been a critic of that in a way that has distinguished you from a lot of voices in the public policy debate over the past several weeks, in the sense that you have been skeptical of the use of retaliatory tariffs. In the past day or so, Prime Minister Carney announced uh, that his government will impose retaliatory tariffs in response to the Trump administration's tariffs on the auto sector. Um, why don't you just reflect on that particular announcement and more broadly what you think the Canadian government should be doing in response to the administration's announcement?
Yeah, I think this latest announcement of an additional salvo of retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. is, as I've been saying throughout the last couple of months, misguided. It's not surprising to hear me say that, perhaps. I think it's misguided, not only because President Trump didn't actually put any additional tariffs on Canada on Wednesday. We were one of the few countries around the world to essentially receive an exemption from this reciprocal tariff plan, at least for now. And so I see very little, economic gain from retaliating against that kind of that announcement, which kind of largely preserved the status quo over the last few months. As a cynic, would probably look at this and say this is primarily a diplomatic strategy aimed at the domestic election. But, I'm not a politician, so that's not my area of expertise. I look at this and I say, putting tariffs on cars coming across the border into Canada from the United States, that's a tax on Canadian consumers. The Canadian government has been going south of the border, paying for advertisements, billboards all across the United States, highlighting that tariffs levied by President Trump are a tax on American consumers. So what are Canadian tariffs on American products? They're taxes on Canadian consumers. You can't escape that logic. The logic is correct when we highlight that President Trump's tariffs are taxes on Americans. We have to, accept that logic works the other way around. Retaliatory tariffs are, there's no denying it, a tax on Canadian consumers, and it's going to make stuff that we as Canadians buy more expensive.
Yeah. Final question, Joseph. A lot of people worried that what we're seeing when we shift through all this data, the last 72 hours, and it was even there maybe before, is the risk of stagflation, that we will have an economic contraction, possibly a global one, as a result of the tariffs. And I can't understate for listeners and viewers how important the Chinese countervailing duties are at 34%. This is China picking up the gauntlet that Trump threw down and putting it on and punching the Americans in the face. And the Chinese, they're not a democracy. They don't face internal pressure as much as the Americans do. And I think it'll be hard for them to back down, having picked up that gauntlet and done what they've done. So what's the concern here, possibly for Canada too, Joseph, in the Bank of Canada? We've seen a recent uptick in inflation. You would think we've just launched a global trade war that could stimulate more inflationary pressure in the economy, limiting the bank's options on interest rates. And yet, we live in an export-led economy. We are going to be very exposed to the global turmoil that's coming down the pipe.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's absolutely the prospect for stagflation, especially in the United States. I think all indicators are pointing to a stagflationary period in the United States of economic decline and rising prices. For me, the biggest worry for how that's going to play out for Canada is that I see inflationary pressure coming from our exposure to American products. Canadian manufacturers use imported inputs from Canada, from the United States. Canadian consumers buy a lot of manufactured products from the United States. As many people know, Canada actually has a trade deficit with the United States, not a trade surplus when we exclude oil. So we actually are, we import a lot of finished products and also intermediate inputs from the United States. And as those things that the United States are producing get more and more expensive as a result of President Trump's tariffs, the cost of production in the United States is going to go up, I do worry that there's a good chance that that could spill over into Canada and put upward pressure on our prices.
Yeah, well said. Well, Joseph, we're just so fortunate to have you writing and commenting here at the Hub. You're one of the clearer practitioners of the dismal science, and we enjoy all of your input and analysis, don't we, Sean?
Yeah, indeed. It's been great to be able to draw on Joseph's expertise. You know, one of the most extraordinary things about this election campaign, of course, Roger, is that we're having this external crisis induced by the Trump administration in the middle of it, and being able to draw on people like Joseph to understand what is increasingly the crucial issue at the backdrop of the campaign has been something that we've appreciated, and I no doubt our audience has as well.
Great. Well, Joseph, we'll get you back on soon. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day.
It's great speaking with you guys as always.
Well, Sean, here's what we'll do. We're going to say goodbye to our listeners who are catching this as an on-demand podcast, and those of you watching this video on demand. But we're going to continue on the other side of that goodbye with our live chat. Let's see if Neo Transit Revolution is back in the chat today, Sean. So let me do that now. I'll say bye-bye, listeners, and bye-bye on-demand viewers. We'll speak to you again soon.